Not every male went off to fight in the First World War. Many occupations were protected by the government because of their national importance. The men who worked in these industries were barred from joining up and therefore had to remain behind in Britain. While you might think that this would come as a relief to these men and their families, there was actually a social stigma attached to remaining behind. This was especially so as the war progressed and the act was seen as cowardly. Officially recognised areas of war work were listed as certified occupations. They were then ranked according to degree of protection and enlistment rate. Those working in lower ranked occupations were more likely to be forced to sign up as conscription came into force. For example, those working in agriculture and munitions were highly protected and therefore less likely to be called up. In contrast, jobs in commerce were not considered to be of national importance and therefore workers were among the first wave of those to have their protection rescinded. If a soldier was on leave, he would wear his uniform in public, proof of his active service. Initially, the man working in a protected occupation had no clear evidence of his national domestic duties and faced daily harassment for his perceived cowardice. To combat this, the government began to issue a series of munitions badges, which would serve as public proof that the wearer was not avoiding his national duties.
And this soon got official notice, and you have the first official badge being the Admiralty Badge, which is issued in late 1914 to shipyard workers whose work was deemed indispensable for the rapid completion of ships and armaments. This was quickly followed up in 1915 by the War Service Badge, which was issued by the War Office for men in what were deemed to be protected occupations. And so this required a list of protected occupations. And these protected or certified occupations were split into 4 categories. You had occupations required for the production of transport of munitions as supplied by the Ministry of Munitions. That was category 1. Category 2 were coal miners, although initially, very interestingly, coal miners were not in the protected list. Then you had agricultural and railway occupations, and finally those occupations which were deemed to be of cardinal importance for the maintenance of trade and industry.
This small badge, dating from 1915, as you can see here, bears the words "On War Service" very clearly. There was no mistaking the wearer for someone avoiding military service. In the centre is a shield bearing the arms of the Royal Ordnance, a government-owned service which manufactured explosives, small arms and ammunition, which employed a large proportion of those on war work. Post-1916 conscription, the list of exempt occupations now included mining, agriculture, cement and brick production, textiles, leather, chemicals and public utilities, all important for keeping the country going and for providing troops with the necessary equipment. Those working in offices, retail and the non-military clothing industry found themselves off the list and vulnerable to conscription. However, there was one last process a man could go through to protect himself from conscription. Tribunals were in place to decide upon particular cases of men who didn't work in a protected occupation but claimed exemption upon the grounds that he was indispensable to his employer or for more personal reasons such as ill health. The Military Service Act of 1916 brought into play a schedule of exemptions.
So conscription is, if you like, a gradual process during the war. At first you have voluntary enlistment, Kitchener's armies. Then you have a slightly different form of moral persuasion known as the Derby Scheme. The Derby Scheme was where men who volunteered their names were promised that they would only be enlisted as and when it was strictly necessary. So this was if you like, a halfway house. Finally, you get the Military Service Act. The Military Service Act comes into force on the 2nd of March 1916, and initially it specifies that men over the age of 18 and under the age of 41 were liable to be called up for service into the army unless they were already serving in the Royal Navy, unless they were married or widowed with children, a minister of religion, or working in one of these this lengthy list of reserved occupations, or indeed either in ill health or previously discharged from the military. So it's quite a complicated list of exclusions. This was then rapidly extended later in 1916, I think in May 1916. Military service for married men was included in a third act in 1918, extended the upper age limit from 41 to 51.
The first on-war service badges for women were given out in July 1915, when 3,108 were issued to women working in armaments firms. However, it wasn't until May 1916 that the pattern for a specific badge for women was issued. This little gold badge here is an example of the 270,000 that were given out. You can tell this was made for women because it's not a badge at all. It's actually more of a brooch, designed this way because women rarely had the facility of a buttonhole. The gold triangle is immediately noticeable and would have been a clear indication that the wearer was doing war work. Women had to wear these badges at all times, along with an identity card, to show that they were entitled to work in a factory. These badges were rather hazardous to wear in danger areas because of the combination of a metal object and sparks. Women faced similar public humiliation to men if they were deemed to be not doing their bit. Wearing these badges showed their dedication to the war effort, as one greeting card shows. A female worker wrote, "With fond greetings from a munitions worker helping to carry on. This badge proves that I'm a worker that can ne'er be dubbed a shirker." Huge pressure was placed on those who remained behind. Most of us are familiar with the white feather of cowardice, given by women to men whom were thought to be neglecting their national duty. On occasions, this aggressive pressure was misaimed. James Lovegrove was the son of a Mayfair tailor and only 16 at the outbreak of the First World War, and therefore ineligible for active service. However, his tender age didn't stop him from coming under pressure from the Order of the White Feather to join the armed forces. One of his diary entries noted a particular example of this. "On my way to work one morning, a group of women surrounded me. They started yelling at me, calling me all sorts of names for not being a soldier. They stuck a white feather in my coat, meaning I was a coward. Oh, I did feel dreadful and ashamed." James felt such anxiety after this episode that he tried to sign up, but on account of his age he was refused. He eventually went on to join the army in 1916 when he came of age, and survived the entire war and lived to the ripe old age of 96. There were many propaganda methods in place to make men sign up, the most famous of these being Lord Kitchener's pointing finger poster. Examples such as these were straightforward in their imagery and messages, depicting a Union Jack or a popular military hero calling for volunteers. Early recruitment efforts were generally light-hearted, but began to adopt a more threatening tone once enlistment levels began to dwindle. Posters began to depict those already fighting, and thus by implication suggesting that those in Britain were not doing their fair share. An example of this is the message, "Who's absent? Is it you?" with John Bull pointing an accusing finger. It was not just the potential recruit that faced public pressure. Families were also expected to make the sacrifice and make their male relatives sign up. Hence, the Women of Britain Say Go poster. It was posters, cigarette cards, lectures and films. They all rammed home the unavoidable message that it was more patriotic and socially acceptable to fight than stay behind. So you can see exactly why the on-war service badges were made available and so readily worn.